the Hudson Library and Historical Society's Through the Eyes of the Artist series presents art historian Felicia Zavarella Stadelman, speaking about the legendary American illustrator Norman Rockwell. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on November 9, 2015.
Good evening and welcome to the Hudson Library. Tonight concludes our fall series of featured artists. We've been fortunate to host Felicia's wonderful art program here for about 2 years now, and we are very excited to continue this series after the new year. We're going to have a special presentation on Henry Matisse in January, so we hope that you will join us in January. I would like to welcome back Felicia Zavarella Stadelman as she presents her series of artist biographical lectures through the eyes of the artist. Tonight she will present on the 20th century American artist Norman Rockwell.
I love that little collective ooh about Matisse. I just want to know how many of you have gone to the Cleveland Museum of Art to see that magnificent. Do not miss this. It is extraordinary. It's one of a kind. There is no one else in the U.S. that's doing this partnership. It's gardens. The end is a big surprise. You'll get goosebumps. It's just, you can't miss it. I get a commission for every ticket I sell. No, I'm just kidding. But it's really worth it. I've got a couple tours going, so I'm going to have a chance to go a few times. But absolutely worth it. They're doing it in conjunction with the Tate Museum. We are the only museum that's doing it, and you will not believe all the artists that are there, including Matisse. So, Tom Scoris, an illustrator, artist, and professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, once said, "People like to think that Norman Rockwell painted Middle America. The truth is, Norman Rockwell invented Middle America." He said, "I'm not a historian. I just painted the things I saw around me, and I was showing the America I knew and observed to others who might not have noticed." Rockwell truly reflected the currents of American life and times. His genius was being able to capture the essence of what is now considered to be America vanished. Before the media revolution and the age of television, people looked forward to and identified with his magazine covers. They captured the emotions of the time, not only what was, but what people would have liked life to have been like. He was known to say, if a picture wasn't going well, I would put a puppy in it. Unfortunately, many people know the look of Norman Rockwell, but not the art of Norman Rockwell. And we really only know it from the reproductions, the calendars, the over-commercialized exploitation in cartoon-like figurines, bells, beer mugs, serving trays, all kind of licensed reprographics. You can't imagine how many people come up to me and say, "I've got this little statue. How much is it worth?" Whatever it's worth to you, because we all feel something special about Norman Rockwell. But it's absolutely necessary to see his original works of art to fully understand Norman Rockwell's talent as a place, holding a place as an American artist. How many of you have been to the Norman Rockwell Museum? And his artwork is breathtaking. One look at an original painting will make you appreciate the quality of his technique, his style, and his craftsmanship. Life magazine once estimated that his pictures have been seen by more people than all of the other artists put together. But very few people know very much about the man behind those paintings. He's a fascinating character. It's not easy to get any sort of definitive perspective on Norman Rockwell. The task is like trying to size up a person in one of those amusement park mirrors. You see a different man at every angle every time you move. He has so many contrasting things. He's a city boy, a country gentleman, a widely read academic. He's also a high school dropout. He's a devoted family man, a bon vivant, and a recluse. He is, of course, a fine artist of rare skill, the all-time #1 magazine cover artist, and probably the most sought-after portraitist of our century. Now, an artist like Norman Rockwell doesn't just happen. It's easy to recognize that in addition to that God-given talent, many decades of study and painstaking labor went into perfecting his skill. Even more important, he said, it took a lot of living, with heartache as well as joy, to develop that sensitivity that sets his work apart from any other artist that we've seen up to this point. His skillful hand is what he called the recorder for my very perceptive eye and understanding heart. The story of how Norman Rockwell developed this rare perception and understanding begins so long ago, in fact, that the length of his career makes him somewhat of an oddity. He had more than 8 decades in which to learn about art, his beloved countrymen, life, and for 6 of those decades, he's been one of the most famous painters. During that lengthy time, he has seen the march of many wars, he's lived in the biggest cities, the quietest hamlets, he's traveled everywhere, puffed his pipe at everyone from peasants to presidents and everything in between, and he painted them all. His beginnings go back to 1894. He was born in New York City. You know, I love my baby pictures. This is new. They're worth millions of dollars for me. He was born February 3rd, 1894, and it always gave Norman Rockwell a great deal of pleasure to tell anyone who asked that he was born in New York City on 100 and Toyd, in a voice that would do a Manhattan cabbie justice. Has anybody ever heard an interview with Norman Rockwell? He's got this great New York accent. So what's it like to be a boy back then, back in the turn of the century, in the Victorian era? First of all, he inherited the family name. And it was one selected by Mrs. Rockwell. She was very proud of her English ancestry, especially one shining ornament on their family tree, and this was an obscure nobleman by the name of Sir Norman Percival. And in his honor, Norman was named Norman Percival Rockwell. It was a name that he came to hate throughout his childhood. His mother was always telling him about Sir Norman. She always emphasized the glorious surname, which had become her son's middle name, and inevitably they called him Percy. So from an early age, he suspected that Percy would forever be regarded as a sissy name by his friends. She always insisted that her second son spell out that second name, the middle name, whenever he wrote his signature. And as soon as he left home, he dropped out that Percival and just put P until people started asking him what the P stood for, and then he dropped it altogether. He was the second son of a textile businessman, Jarvis. His mother was Nancy, and young Norman showed a talent right from the beginning. In fact, he remembers his first sketches as drawings of warships during the Spanish-American War. Now, keep in mind that the lectures that I give you are based on primary source information. The letters the artists wrote to each other, to family and friends, what journalists wrote about these artists, their journals that they wrote themselves. Norman Rockwell kept a very detailed journal of interesting stories. There's also a number of letters written about him, so my presentations kind of change every year the more letters I get. And there's an incredible biography that you can get, which I usually bring with me, but I have 2 copies. They've both been borrowed out, and you usually get them in the back of that bookstore where nobody wants them, and it's for like 40 cents. I'll give you the name of it if you send me an email or something. So a lot of this information is from his notes, his journals, the interviews, and letters that he wrote. So his father, he said, enjoyed reading various literary masterpieces aloud to his family, especially the works of Dickens. And young Norman, knowing that we didn't have any pictures in books at that time, would actively listen as he sketched the characters while his fathers read the story aloud, and he would pass the pictures around. Now, his maternal grandfather was Howard Hill, his mother, Nancy's father, and he influenced Norman Rockwell because he was an artist as well. And his grandfather painted, this is a painting done by his grandfather, every detail, every hair on a dog, the highlights in a pig's eye, he would say. And his grandfather's primitive canvases in rural backyard scenes of animals and farm buildings were great exercises in detail, and that was Norman Rockwell's first teacher. Although he was fascinated by some of his grandfather's paintings, he was never encouraged by his mother to follow in her old man's footsteps. She despised her father, and all artists, as a matter of fact, because he had been a failure, and as Norman puts it, little on the alcoholic side. So Nancy was convinced that the ups and downs of being an artist caused her father to drink. Mr. Rockwell saw to it that his sons had very little time for anything that wasn't devoted to schoolwork or some sort of church activity. The children were forbidden to read comics or the Sunday newspaper. Norman was a choir boy in his congregation at the cathedral, which involved singing at 4 different services on Sunday, 3 midweek rehearsals, a rehearsal on Friday evening, and that occupied most of the time that wasn't taken up with schoolwork. He said, life with my parents was sedate. My father stayed strictly within the confines of proper conduct during those Victorian days. He was stern and always distant. Norman's mother, he said, was frequently ill, constantly complaining about it. Family life revolved around mother resting on the couch with a cold towel on her head, while the rest of the family remained still and quiet. He said, on the days that we were asked to be especially quiet, my brother and I would sneak up the narrow stairs to the rooftop of the apartment building, and there we would lean over the roof and spit on all of our friends below. But it was quiet activity, he said. This is how he describes himself. I have spindly legs, narrow shoulders, a prominent Adam's apple, rather dark, curly, reddish-brown hair. I wore thick, round glasses. Then as an adult, I was pigeon-toed. And to try to correct this condition, my parents had fitted him with heavy orthopedic shoes when he was about 10 years old that he wore until he was 17. He had always been about as agile as a penguin on rough ground, he said, and the new shoes only made him walk more clumsily and just about put an end to any kind of athletic activity. The fact that Norman was the fielder who stumbled and the batter who always struck out emphasized more and more the fact that his brother was the star athlete. He said Jarvis was the best athlete in the entire school. He was good at baseball, wrestling, gymnastics. He outshone me in everything. Norman wasn't a good student either. He often used his drawing skills to amuse his friends, and he got into a lot of trouble doing this. He wasn't bad at everything, though. The sketching that he began to engage in when he was only about 6 years old grew more and more into a specialty that allowed him to excel. Unfortunately, when he should have been reading or studying, he was illuminating the margins of his books with, like another artist that we know, Claude Monet. Naturally, this didn't win him any high grades in any of the subjects that he should have been studying. Surprisingly, he never even got good grades in his art class. And when people asked him why he got D's and C's in his art class, he said, probably because I'm not much good at going by the book at anything I do. He especially loved summers in the country. He never liked the city life. The summers he spent catching frogs and fishing, and it supplied him with a lot of inspiration for his later work. He spent his childhood and adolescence in New York, significant summer excursions in the country. He said he felt a strong connection, not only with nature, but with the people who had lived on nature's terms. Now, creative talent is a hard thing to suppress, and some say that it just flows out of artists, and that's true. At 13, he knew that creative art was the only thing he wanted to do in his life. So during his freshman year at Mamaroneck High School, he used some of the few dollars that he earned doing odd chores to pay for lessons at an accredited art school. And every Saturday, he commuted to New York to attend classes at the Chase School of Fine and Applied Art. It required a 2-hour subway ride, but it opened a whole new world to Norman. The next year, in 1908, he received permission from the principal to take off every Wednesday so that he could attend classes there as well as on Saturday. He was only 14, and yet he already knew that he couldn't think of anything else but having a life in art. Now, this attitude got very little support from home. He would go out to his classes, and as soon as he would come home, his mother would have thrown away everything that he was working on up to that point. He had to earn his own tuition in order to attend art classes, his father told him. So that summer, Norman was fortunate enough to add to his earnings by giving art lessons every Saturday. And he had confided to his minister that he had some financial problems, and he was able to help. The minister knew of a wealthy parishioner who had just been asking him to recommend someone who could provide sketching instruction for her and a friend. And that friend turned out to be Ethel Barrymore. Now, it proved to be a delightful job for this young man. His function was mostly escorting these two ladies on their Saturday outings to the beach. He would take them by canoe to some quiet spot along the Long Island Sound. He said, then I would help them set up their easels, and from there on, it was mostly a matter of looking wise and professional, which wasn't so easy at the age of 15, making a few helpful comments from time to time as they applied their watercolors to their hazy paper. I would offer suggestions to the older students as their paintings progressed, but I was so overcome by Miss Barrymore's glamour that I really didn't know what I was doing, he said. After a couple hours, the ladies would finish their hazy watercolors and be ready for a picnic that they brought along with a wicker basket. He said those Saturday sessions with Miss Barrymore were the start of Norman Rockwell's never-ending love affair with the theater. Throughout his life, whenever he got a commission to paint the portrait of a famous actor or actress, he would drop everything like the starstruck fan that he was at 15. Now he was even more committed to, in the middle of his sophomore year, that he wanted to become an artist. So he leaves high school, quits, drops out altogether, and he becomes a full-time art student. He said, I would shed my childish ways and hope that I would eventually have the glittering, glamorous life of a famous artist. That was his dream. Now, he wanted a larger school with a broader scope and a staff and a curriculum, and he found that at the National Academy School, which was the biggest institution of its type in New York, and attendance there offered some prestige, as well as a chance to select an instructor from a widely distinguished group of teachers. The National Academy School was classical in nature, following the French tradition. The curriculum demanded that all students start out with intensive concentration on the human form. And for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, he labored away. He said, it was a great day when I was allowed into my first life drawing class. It didn't bother me that I was directed to a spot way in the corner of the room to set up my easel. Each student was assigned a definite spot for a particular posing period, which was about 6 weeks. He said, my view was a strange one during those first few weeks. Every day the model posed in the same position, lying on her side, facing away from him. He said, from this location at the back of the room with several other students in front of me, all I could see clearly of this beautiful young lady, nude young lady, was her feet and her rear end. He said, which was of generous proportions. He said, that's all I saw, that's all I drew, over and over again for 6 weeks. So in every interview, he would say, I started my career in figure drawing from the bottom up. In 1910, at the ripe old age of 16, he enrolled in his third art school. Now, the Art Students League had exactly what he was looking for. The atmosphere was bohemian. The students were talking about this wild life of becoming an artist. They were all wrapped up in art, and they tried to help each other. And when they got discouraged, as they often did, they were there to stimulate their ideas. Besides finding the kind of friends that he could relate to, he also discovered two outstanding teachers who inspired him to become the artist that he eventually became. George Bridgman was one of the teachers of draftsmanship at the Art Students League, and he selected Bridgman purely by accident. There were no other teachers available, he said. He didn't know one teacher from another, so it was the happiest accident he ever had in life. Now, Bridgman was a bohemian sort of character. Norman describes him as always looking as if he had just fought his way through a rush hour subway crowd. He was stocky, ruddy-faced. He combed his hair with his fingers. His clothes always presented a steamy, weary appearance. He said he had a habit of tugging at his tie, which always caused it to be a bit offside, especially if he had too much to drink. He always stopped for a few nips at the neighborhood saloon before coming to class, but that didn't bother any of his students. He said it made him more enthusiastic on the knowledge that he had to impart to his pupils, and they absolutely loved him. He would say, look how this model is put together. She's got bones and muscles under the flesh. Don't just look at her skin. And then he would take an oil or grease pencil and he would draw right on the model where the bones and everything were. The models would always flinch when they saw him coming, approaching him with that oil stick. None of them dared to voice their objection. He said jobs were too hard to find then. He said Mr. Bridgman walked around the studio constantly with a cigar dangling from his mouth, and he commented on every work of art of the 30 or 40 who might be in the class that afternoon. After peering over the apprehensive student's shoulder for a moment, he would nudge the poor fellow and say, "Get up." He had no time for niceties, Norman said. Then he would sit down at the pupil's place and indicate those corrections with that thick pencil. Where the student had been picking away at a very delicate drawing, he would take that black oil stick and draw right on your canvas. He said, "Here's the spine, can't you see it? Build around that." And Norman said that's when he liked your work. He said if you were doing what he thought was a lousy job, it was much worse. You see, he never smoked that cigar. He just chewed on it until all the juice was out of it and it was kind of slippery. If he hated your drawing, he'd sit down on your chair for a while, glaring at your sketch, chewing on that cigar harder and harder until he couldn't contain himself any longer. And then he would lurch forward and spit tobacco juice right on the top of his canvas. He even has some pictures of this tobacco juice running down his canvas. In those days, there was very little false snobbery about being an illustrator. That was someone who was considered to be an artist for books and magazines. They weren't considered to be inferior at all. The high regard for which illustration was held at is because of the exceptionally high state of art at the time by these illustrators. This period came around the turn of the century, and it's often referred to as the golden age of illustration. The great books of the day, Mark Twain, Thomas Hardy, they were all filled with great illustration by some of these prominent artists. Newspapers and magazines commissioned these great illustrator artists like Frederick Remington to travel throughout the West and sketch the American life, the new frontier. One of the finest artists, illustrators of the time was Winslow Homer. Oh, my apologies, I got a photograph of Thomas Fogarty. He was the illustration artist that Norman Rockwell was learning under at the time that he was at school. So one of the finest artists was Winslow Homer. He was an illustrator and proud of it for Harper's Weekly for almost 20 years. The Golden Age, however, was coming to an end, and it was around the time that Norman Rockwell was in art school. Three of the great illustrators, Frederick Remington, Edwin Austin Abbey, and Howard Pyle, had all died. And it was Norman's dream that he might someday walk in the footsteps of these great illustrators. And as it turned out, he literally did, in a way that he never expected. A few years later, he would rent a studio in New Rochelle, which belonged to the very famous Frederick Remington. He had used it for a time, so literally he would stand in the footsteps of Frederick Remington. Now, even with a scholarship to take care of his tuition, he continued to have some trouble with finances. He had expenses, commuting, his art supplies that his mother kept throwing out. And to take care of those expenses, he managed to locate employment through a fellow student, and the two boys became extras at the Metropolitan Opera House on Broadway. Now, that may sound like a great opportunity, but the pay was 50 cents a night. Now, ever since he had given those watercolor classes to Ethel Barrymore, he remained hopelessly stage-struck, and now opera was showbiz, the singing type of showbiz, and he sang in the choir. So it was very appropriate for him, they thought. He had sung so many times, it practically made him a pro. He soon learned from the management of the Metropolitan Opera Company that they could have cared less about his choral ability. The instructions to the extras were, keep your mouth shut, move your lips when you're on stage as if you're singing, but not to spoil the sound by actually letting out any loud noises. Now, his true assignment would be something like a spear carrier or a peasant or other scenarios that called for masses of people milling around the town. The principals would always be the main cast and singing their arias, and there would be people in the background, and it was fun. And it brought him in contact with the most famous of all opera stars, Enrico Caruso. Now, how I know this, and this was at the height of Enrico's career, is because I was thinking of adding music to my series, and I've been thinking about operas and musicians, and I started reading the letters of Enrico Caruso, who wrote hundreds of letters, and his talk is going to be fascinating. I ran across a letter where he talked about this story of Norman Rockwell, so I had to add it. The mere mention of Caruso's name would bring this whoop of laughter out of Norman Rockwell, not the reaction you would expect to hear from this ultimate opera star, from a former choir boy. Caruso somehow found out that Norman Rockwell and his friend were art students, and he said, I sought out the pair, Norman Rockwell, and his friend's name was Groth, I guess that was his last name, and confided in them that I was also interested in art. And he said, Norman Rockwell said, no, Caruso was quite good at the caricatures, although he never really took formal lessons. So Caruso was proud of the fact that he had caricatures published in La Foglia, which was an Italian-American magazine for the opera. And during the waiting periods at rehearsals, Caruso would get his pencil and paper from one of the directors, and he would make these bitingly pertinent caricatures, he said, of some of the hefty divas or male singers that were on the stage above. He would show them to his two art students to get their professional evaluation. As you might imagine, they were honored at having to give their opinion sought out by the world-famous opera star, so they tended to be very enthusiastic about his sketches. And he said, seeing how smart they were, I reciprocated by singling them out for special little favors. Now, on one such instance that he writes about, and Norman Rockwell also writes about, is an incident that relates to Caruso's sketching, and it occurred when the troupe was putting on Aida for one of the last acts of the opera, where the Egyptian general, of course played by Caruso, was arrested, and Groth and Norman Rockwell were his guards, and their parts were simple. They had to walk beside Caruso carrying the spears while he was being sentenced to death, this remorse of the turn of events he was singing about. The key elements would be that the guards would parade downstairs leading to this tomb where the king would be sealed, left to suffocate. As soon as the trio got below, where no one could see them, Caruso seated himself on the chairs provided, and he would make some of those caricatures of the people that were still left on stage. He said, Norman Rockwell said, he'd do a little singing while he was supposed to be suffocating. But that posed no problems, and whenever it came time for Caruso to let out a moan or a groan or a lament, he would turn his head briefly towards the stairwell, shoot the sound up subterraneanly from that hideaway, and the famous singer kept sketching away the whole time. Now, another part that Caruso recalls vividly was when Norman Rockwell and his friend were required to haul a heavyweight female singer off stage. He was paired with his buddy again, his two favorite people. And in this scene, Caruso was naturally playing the hero. He had been wounded. He was dying one of opera's typically slow deaths. And while singing his death aria, Caruso would be discovered by his sweetheart, the hefty diva. And as you expect, she would swoon around, stunned by such poor health that her lover was in. Expressing her shock in a brief song, she would plunk heavily down onto the stage boards. And that's where Norman and his friend came into the act. They said, as experienced extras and buddies of Caruso, they had been selected from the ranks of the villagers witnessing this tragic scene to pick up the diva and gently carry her off stage. That wasn't easy. Caruso said the heroine was one of the biggest sopranos in the whole field of opera, and they grew them exceedingly hefty in those days, he said. So he continues, even though she was just about the size of a small horse, Rockwell and his friend managed to lug her into the wings during the first several performances with some strain but no insurmountable difficulties. This was mostly due to Norman Rockwell's friend, who was kind of strong, extremely sturdily built, Caruso said, and he naturally assumed the task of grasping the big woman around her ample bosom, and Norman would pick up her feet and carry her off. One night, disaster struck. The soprano finished wailing about her expiring lover. She spun around, and when she executed her swoon, she altered her customary position on the floor. It was dark. Groth darted forward as usual, grabbed the nearest part to her. It turned out to be her legs, not her torso, which he had always tackled. Norman was left with no choice but to take hold of the heavier main section of the fat lady. Those are Norman's words. Caruso says he simply could not manage the task of hoisting her. And although he kept trying valiantly to get her big rump off the floor so that he could carry her off stage, nothing moved. The best he could do was bounce her up and down a few times. Well, this broke up Caruso. He said, I was supposed to be about 95% dead, both quiet and rigid. Instead, I rose up to watch this ridiculous spectacle that the boys were providing, shouting advice to them. Instead of dying of my wounds, I was dying of laughter. Well, the stage manager was dying, too, of embarrassment. The male star was rolling on the floor laughing. During the saddest scene of the opera, the female star was being bounced up and down by a couple of clowns who couldn't lift her, and she was hysterical. That was the last time Norman Rockwell and his friend ever got entrusted with that particular job. It's a wonder that they even wound up staying in the opera house after that fiasco. It was in part due to the fact that Caruso just found them to be too much fun. He always got what he wanted at the Met. Caruso said he was perpetually amused by the baggy tights that Norman wore because bare legs weren't allowed on the stage. All the extras had to wear tights. And Norman Rockwell was so skinny that they were always too loose, especially in the seat. And he said, I would come by, grab a handful of fabric on Norman's rear, and yank it up to take up the slack. Now, the reason I tell you these stories is because these are the memories that Norman Rockwell always referred to as his inspiration into the stories behind his canvas. He felt that the characters of his past, and these are his words, as well as the absurd episodes that I experienced, all weaved into the humorous storytelling that he projects into each painting. Now, incidentally, Norman Rockwell almost always put a self-portrait in his paintings. Did you know that? It's kind of like a Where's Waldo thing. He's over there in the corner with that big long neck and glasses as a young boy, and he almost always, when an older man was required, he would put George Bridgman, his teacher, and he's the man hanging over, although he gave him hair this time, hanging over the balcony with his cigar or pipe. And I'll show you another place where George Bridgman is in there. So now at the tender age of 16, still a student at the Art Students League, he started becoming restless and he was looking for more suitable work. And he hardly began hunting around in the director's offices in search of work when he struck it rich. He landed a well-paying assignment with a good publisher, and the title of the book was Tell Me Why Stories. Each chapter in the book opened with a child asking his parents certain things, and he was paid $150 for each illustration. Now, fashionable illustrators of the time, like N.C. Wyeth, J.C. Leyendecker, they were all powerful influences on Norman Rockwell during his early years, and he studied every magazine. He had this admiration for these illustrators that kind of became obsessive. He would check out the kind of brushes they used, how they got their ideas, what their studios looked like. If he ever saw them around town, he would follow them around just to see how they acted. He had to work at his craft, but in 1914, he was also hired as the art director of Boys Life magazine, which was the official publication of the Boy Scouts based on the recommendations from the Tell Me Why stories. He continued to work with the Scouts, illustrating the official Boy Scout calendar for 50 years, incidentally. And once he started earning money, he never took pay from the Boy Scouts for his illustrations. He just did it as kind of a way to give back. Now, as he began to get paid for his paintings and illustrations, he became more and more dissatisfied with the inconvenience of working from home because his mother was still throwing everything away, hiding things under the couch. She really didn't want her son to become an artist. So that's when he decides to move to New Rochelle, and he sets up a studio with a cartoonist by the name of Clyde Forsyth. He started freelancing for a number of other magazines like Literary Digest, Country Gentleman, and as his portfolio grew, so did his confidence in his artwork. At the age of 22 years old, 1916, he mustered up enough courage to go and try to sell his first cover to the most famous popular magazine at the time, Saturday Evening Post. It was very prestigious illustrator for the Saturday Evening Post. In March of that year, filled with trepidation and loaded down with a very large wooden case containing 2 framed paintings and a sketch, a homemade wooden case, he headed for Philadelphia. He said, "I had to drag this weighty box several blocks to the commuter train that went to Grand Central, carry it from there all the way to Penn Station because I wasn't allowed on the subway with it, maneuver it into the Philadelphia run, up the freight elevator to the Curtis Publishing Building lobby. When he finally puffed his way into this elegant marble chamber that served as a reception room, he learned that no one ever saw the art director without an appointment." However, he was announced to the art director, Walter Dower, after sitting down, wiping the tears from his eyes. And like his prestigious boss, Mr. Dower, he did not grant interviews to any ragtag artist who showed up, but he told the receptionist that he was curious to peek in the contents of that monstrous black oilcloth covered case. He said it was just too strange to be ignored. So after studying the pictures for a few minutes, he directed Norman to wait while he carried the paintings off into the inner recess of the building. And when he finally reappeared, it was to pronounce very reverently that Mr. Lorimer himself had looked at the pictures and liked all of them. He'd been invited to develop other sketches with the assurance that Mr. Dower would be pleased to see them anytime he was ready for submission, and he didn't need an appointment. His first cover was this one, an uncomfortable young boy wearing this bowler hat, dressed somewhat maturely for his age. Of course, his friends are going off to play, but he's got to babysit. It's called Mother's Day Off, and it was May 20th, 1916, and it ran on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. As soon as the covers began appearing, the doors to other magazine departments were flung open, welcome mats carefully smoothed out. He received assignments from magazines like Life. At the time, it was a very popular humor magazine, as well as Leslie's and The Judge. The world was looking rosier all the time. Now, with a painting on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, he had established himself as a major league illustrator. And that same year, he meets a young woman who he shared a phone line with. Remember when they had phone lines? That started talking to her, and within 3 days, he proposed to her on the phone. Her name was Irene O'Connor. They married too young. They had nothing in common. She hated art, but she knew that his new lifestyle was on the horizon. And Americans were extremely receptive to Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post covers. In fact, it was the beginning of a 324 cover relationship between Norman Rockwell and the Saturday Evening Post, portraying American life and values. His covers were so successful that when his art appeared on the cover, they would sell 75,000 additional copies at the newsstand. The covers eventually became his greatest legacy. Now, during the 1920s, he became the leading Post cover artist. He painted about 10 cover pictures per year for that magazine at rates that started from the original $75 until they got into the thousands of dollars per cover. He painted for other magazines too, for advertising agencies. Those clients offered the highest fees of all. His income spiraled towards the end of the decade. He was earning over $40,000 a year annually, which is the equivalent to about $450,000 in today's dollars. And that was in the time of almost non-existent taxes, all the groceries that you could carry in a bag for just a couple dollars. And with the advent of the 20s, there was a boom period where living high was the thing to do, and so he and his new wife began to move along right with the trend. Their income rose steadily throughout this decade so that they could afford to keep up with the affluent suburban executive set of New Rochelle. His salary never went below that point, even during the Great Depression. He was riding high. His wealth exceeded his wildest imagination. With nothing in common, he and his new wife spent a lot of time with friends. They went to one party after another in the upper class community that they lived in New Rochelle. They were invited to every party on the East Coast, partly because of his popularity. He was the magazine cover artist of the time in this New Rochelle community. Top of the hit parade, he said. He was no longer introverted or self-conscious. He said it wasn't just Irene who was into the fun and games. I played the part of a bon vivant famous artist, and people who had a lot of money and threw big parties always wanted this famous artist there. He said I was added to the affair just to add a little color. As the money began to come in at a faster clip, he said Irene and I managed to step up the outgo accordingly. It was the jazz age. Everything was supposed to move at a fast tempo. He said it was the decade of prohibition, speakeasies, the hip flask, the heyday of the Great Gatsby, flappers in shimmery skirts, he said, and vodeo-do. Irene loved the social swirl. She kept their calendar full of party dates. He learned to play bridge and tennis. He took up golf, since that was supposed to be what you did if you were rich in New Rochelle. He also went along with the other social customs in town. He said, I regularly received private deliveries of liquid refreshment from one of the very best bootleggers in the area who was reputed to dispense the smoothest stuff around. He was always a ham actor at heart. He began to appear at parties with a scarlet-lined opera cape on top of a tuxedo. He said, naturally, I needed a top hat to go with it. He sported a fancy cane. I'm still looking for that picture if anybody has seen it. And about this time, when he acquired his elegant evening outfit, he said, I decided to get a vivid yellow Jackrabbit Roadster for my flamboyant side. And for someone as distinguished as myself, I got a black Pearl Packard Roadster, which he whizzed around town in, with him behind the wheel and his ever-present trail of smoke in the wind, this massive midnight-hued car with its huge headlights gleaming chrome in the front. He said, I looked like a small locomotive blasting down the roadways. Everybody knew the car, everybody knew Norman and Irene. Now, this is what he writes in his journals. Not only was ours a very busy social life, but a swinging one as well. Norman Rockwell, a swinger. He said quite a bit of heavy drinking was involved everywhere we went. In our set, a family bootlegger was considered more important than a family doctor, or maybe he just came first. He said along with the serious drinking, a considerable amount of hanky-panky was accepted as part of the game. That wasn't supposed to be serious, just casual fun, not allowed to continue too long with one partner, he said. Goodbye to the old Norman, he writes. He had to schedule his paintings around his busy social life, and this was one of the covers that he put up at that time. He said, after dragging in from a long night, I found it very difficult to work. When his workload got too heavy, he said I would plan a trip with no scheduled return date. Irene never went with me. Now, that lifestyle couldn't last. The married to young swinging couple found themselves drifting apart. She actually left him for another man. The marriage ended, their 14-year marriage ended in divorce in 1928. Now, the divorce forced Norman to take a closer look at his lifestyle. He had become an international playboy, he calls himself. He said, a real departure from the world that I represented in my illustrations. In the 1920s and 30s, his work developed what he called a greater breadth and character. My use of humor, he said, which had already become an important part of my work, helped me to center myself. It was a technique that he used very effectively in order to draw the viewer into the composition, to share the magic of the moment. He said, I usually get my best ideas when I shave in the morning. I draw them on 3x5 squares of paper, then discard them until I get the one that I can go with. Now, his internal art of storytelling became integrated with his external outstanding skills as an artist. And what emerged is what we know today as the incredible facility in judging just the perfect moment. When to stop the action, snap the picture, when all of the elements that defined or embellished the total story was in place. George is in that picture, second from the end in the corner with his juicy little cigar. And this is Norman that the woman is actually talking about. In the 1930s, he said, it proved to be an amazing decade for me. Refocused, I traveled to California where I got a different view of the world. And it was there that he meets Mary Barstow. He said she was everything that I had been led to believe. It was a blind date. She said she was a vivacious young woman who made him feel right at ease, always delighted him with her knowledgeable conversation about artists and art. He said she was fairly tall in her high heels, almost as tall as Norman, wavy brown hair, sparkling brown eyes, a pretty heart-shaped face. He said almost too good to be true. She was so young and radiant, how could she be interested in an old divorced man like himself? Mary told him that she had just graduated from Stanford University that previous summer and was now teaching at an elementary school in San Gabriel. He learned that she was 22, he was 36. It was too much of a difference for things to work out. But after 2 weeks, they were engaged. Married 2 months later, he said, Mary was the stabilizing gyroscope in my life. She took one fast look at the free and easy social life of Westchester County and decided the new Mr. and Mrs. Rockwell would have none of that. He put away his opera cape. He resigned from the yacht club. Instead of tooling around town, he said, I put in a solid day's work every day with no juggling of schedules for parties or hangovers. And he said, I was never happier. Mary took a genuine interest in his work. She was always pleased to discuss whatever he was doing. She even read to him every day while he painted, like his father did when he was young. He said, Mary read me almost every best-selling novel or biography that had been published. She went through the complete works of Dickens, Henry James, Tolstoy, and Jane Austen. In 1935, their first son was born. He felt that he could no longer paint. He said, the quality of my work didn't satisfy me, and the art world was changing, and he felt that it was passing him by. With his wife and child, he decided to go to Paris. He said he needed to study. He writes, Picasso and Matisse were developing new approaches to art. There were futurists and expressionists and surrealists, all trying all sorts of wild and wonderfully imaginative approaches to painting and abstraction. My whole career looked like it was going down the drain. They spent 7 months in Paris. He tried several schools, and his instructors were at a loss as to what they might teach a man who earned more money in a week than they ever dreamed of even imagining that they would earn in a year. During that time, he painted 3 covers, abstract style. They were all turned down, except for this one. He learned very little, he said, except that the answer to his problems lay within himself. In the mid-1930s, he was approached to illustrate new editions of Mark Twain classics, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, and always taking his work to the next level, he traveled to Hannibal, Missouri, the setting for Mark Twain's legendary novels, to depict a more realistic illustration of these fictional adventures. While he was there, he created sketches for the city, brought home authentic regional costumes for the models to wear while he painted the illustrations. He said illustrating the classic novels helped him to regain his confidence, and he was finally satisfied with his work for the first time in his life. The couple moved to Arlington, Vermont. He vacationed there very often for many years. Their sons, Jarvis, Thomas, and Peter, were with them at the time. The stability of the family proved a ready source of inspiration. They were almost always in the portraits that he did of young children, which incidentally they resented later in life. The peaceful nature of Vermont was right out of his paintings, and he felt right at home there. He started to realize what a celebrity he had become during his Vermont years, and he flourished there. Now, I lived in New England for a while, and I did a lot of Norman Rockwell lectures, and then we would go to the museums, and of course there were always people in the audience who knew Norman Rockwell, their family knew them, and it was wonderful when a beautiful young woman who was in her late 80s came up to me with this big scrapbook one day and said she was the woman in the white skirt. Showed me pictures of herself. She was stunning and still beautiful. I still write to her grandchildren, incidentally. Now, Grandma Moses was one of his friends, neighbor, lived right next door. She also became one of his models a few times. She was a living part of Americana, and so was he. They were national treasures. But he never took himself very seriously. Once he received his paintings back from the magazine, if he ever got them back, he figured that they had served their purpose and they were worth nothing. So he routinely would take the canvases out of the frames, throw the canvases away, and use the frames again. Fortunately, one of his assistants, Gene Pelham, kept a few of those canvases, this one in particular. Gene recalled how surprised Norman Rockwell was the first time anyone offered to buy his paintings for decorative purposes. He said one day, Norman Rockwell said, "Hey, Gene, look here. I just got this letter for some crazy woman in Chicago. She has a big recreation room in her house, and she wants some of my original Saturday Evening Post cover drawings to put on her walls. She wants several of the paintings, and she wants to pay me $100 a piece." Can you imagine that? So he was delighted to pack up several of his paintings, 7 in all, that he had laying around his studio. He shipped them off to that nutty woman in Chicago. He regarded this as an unexpected windfall for work that he had already produced, and for her $700, she received an art collection that was sold recently by her grandson in the early 1990s for $17 million. He always had a cavalier attitude towards his work in those days. Did you know that Rosie the Riveter was modeled after Michelangelo's One of the Prophets in the Sistine Chapel? That's one of my favorite illustrations. It was a time of the local art show in Arlington. Each year they had a spring art fair. Everyone who could paint was invited to put something up on the wall at his exhibition. And with his customary humility, he figured it was perfectly logical for him, being an artist and the most famous illustrator, to hang his work next to some of the other students that were around him, the Sunday painters of the area. So as a joke, he put up this painting, the April Fool Post cover. Now, this was one of his favorite paintings. And the rub was that he was particularly fond of this painting. He didn't want to sell it. He was just kind of putting it up as a little ha-ha joke. And he didn't think anyone would buy it, so he put on this ridiculous price tag of $2,500. And he gave it to the exhibit committee along with the other entries, and to his amazement, the painting sold. The picture had been sold at that outrageous price to Gracie Lambert. She was the heiress to a pharmaceutical company, Fortune. She didn't care about what the price tag was. She liked the painting. So this was upsetting to Norman Rockwell because he didn't need the money, but it was one of those paintings that he wanted to keep. So he learned who purchased it. He immediately got in touch with her, offered to buy it back from her, even at a profit. He was infuriated when she adamantly refused, until he agreed to buy it back for $9,000. He vowed never to get wrapped up in such foolishness again, he said. Now, it was during this time in Vermont, 1942, that he painted one of his most overtly political, important pieces in response to a speech given by President Franklin Roosevelt. Rockwell made a series of paintings that dealt with the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And throughout the mid-1940s, these paintings traveled around the country being shown in conjunction with the sale of war bonds. And they were viewed by more than 1 million people. The popularity was considered to be a very important part of the war effort at home. They were reproduced in 4 consecutive issues of the Saturday Evening Post, alongside essays by contemporary American writers. And the 4 freedoms were so successful that the works toured an exhibition that raised $159.9 million for the war effort through the sale of war bonds. And when you gave money towards the war effort, you got a print of one of these. No other pictures in history ever had been so widely printed and distributed. Now, in 1943, just days after delivering the last original canvas of his 4 Freedoms paintings, disaster struck. His studio was destroyed by a tremendous late-night fire. After the fire quieted down to a smolder, he was heard making only one comment: "There goes my life's work." It has been estimated by Norman that the studio contained about 130 original paintings, countless sketches at the time that it burned, but more important to him, it represented a loss of 28 years of the accumulation of all the useful aids to painting that he painstakingly gathered from many countries. His wardrobe held about 300 costumes, many of them tailor-ordered or purchased on distant trips. He had a library of prints from practically every artist and illustrator at the time, file box after file box of referenced documents, stacks of fine brushes he bought in Germany before the war, he said the kind you couldn't get anymore, an extensive collection of antique guns, all sorts of memorabilia from pewter mugs to gold medals, awards, stacks of personal photographs, correspondence records, etc. Even his pipe collection went down to the ground. To this day, nobody knows how the fire started. Norman speculated that when he switched off the light in the studio late at night, after having spent some time talking with a few friends, he may have dropped some of the ashes from his pipe in a cushion that was on a seat below the light switch. Other people pointed out that he had a bad habit of tapping out his pipe and throwing matches into this big copper kettle where he put his turpentine rags. Devastated, he decided he needed a change, and he started to focus his attention on the everyday environment. His pictures took an about face and changed dramatically. He became an angry man, disinterested in life around him, but aggravated about what was going on in the world. He focused his attention on painting the president, a large canvas for the UN, a calendar series for the Boy Scouts, which he still never took any money for, a card assignment that he did for Hallmark, which led to 19 more cards. His most popular cover was a scene in a restaurant where all the other diners stopped to watch a young boy and his grandmother say grace. This was Norman Rockwell's new favorite cover. Although he was at the peak of his powers, his home life was disintegrating. His family was routinely seduced by invitations of intimacy, not only in his paintings, but now in the many interviews he was giving during this time. But he had established a resistant distance when he tried to respond to them. He just wasn't involved in his family life. And his real sensitivity was reserved for his art. His empathy he lavished all of his empathy on his easel day after day for 6 decades. He said, "I was simply too tired and too overworked to relate to anyone or anything outside of my paintings." He tended to free himself of what he called his internal tensions in his paintings, he said, so that the energy that might have been expended on my wife and the work of rearing my 3 sons exploded onto the narrative stories on the canvas instead of at home. Now, in addition, Mary had been struggling against alcoholism and depression, possibly a bipolar illness, for at least 5 years, and Norman never noticed. The family had been racked by the demise of their formerly predictable upper middle class home. Their mother, who had previously been the anchor of their household, suddenly needed all the attention. Boarding school plans had to be canceled in an attempt to rally around her. Trips were rescheduled. Tremendous amounts of money were poured into treatments for her. And finally, a permanent move was undertaken from Arlington, Vermont, where they had lived since 1939, to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where it became clear that her treatments at the Austin Riggs Center would be long-term, and she was being treated for depression and alcoholism. As a result, each of the boys suffered because of the difficulties of their mother. For them, drugs and alcohol became a way to escape. Unknown to the family, as they struggled to adjust to Mary's illness and Norman's distant perfectionism, he was suffering simultaneous thoughts of suicide, and he attempted on 3 unsuccessful occasions to end his life. 6 years after the move, Mary died unexpectedly at 51. Now, in 1960, in an attempt to get back on track and to eliminate all of the memories of a very difficult time in his life, Norman Rockwell, with the help of his son Thomas, published his autobiography, My Adventures as an Illustrator, and I'm sure many of us have this in our libraries. The book intentionally eliminated all of the difficult times in his life. Irene's not mentioned, nor is Mary. It was meant to portray Norman Rockwell as a character right out of one of his pictures. The book proved to be a success. Excerpts were carried in 8 consecutive Saturday Evening Post issues. He erased all that was negative. He said, "I was back to living in utopia again." Now, a new model appears on the scene in 1961. Molly Punderson was a former school teacher, retired after 39 years as an English instructor at the very prestigious Milton Academy near Boston. She returned back to Stockbridge, where she always maintained a summer cottage. She had friends in town and always was leading a very busy life, closely scheduled. She was a bit at loose ends now that she was retired, and she and Norman hit it off right away. Molly married Norman Rockwell, who was a widower at 67, and began a new career as the all-around helpmate to one of America's busiest artists. They continued to live in Stockbridge, create nostalgic masterpieces. She would say to him, "It's time for your nap." Right around 11 o'clock, she would make sure that he stopped working in time to have a brief nap before lunch. There are about 10,000 pictures of Norman Rockwell taking naps anywhere and everywhere. She said he's liable to work right through without eating if someone doesn't remind him to rest. After lunch, they would go out for a 5-mile bike ride every day. Another one of thousands of pictures of Norman Rockwell and Molly. In 1963, after 47 years at the Saturday Evening Post, he parted ways with the magazine. The last cover was the portrait of John F. Kennedy as a memorial to the tragic shooting. He went on to do work for Look magazine almost immediately, and there he was able to express his deepest concerns and interests, such as civil rights and the war on poverty. Some of his most powerful creations came out of the covers that he had for Look magazine. One such piece was inspired by the unjust murders of 3 civil rights workers near Philadelphia. The painting was called, in Mississippi. The painting was called Southern Justice, and it was done in 1965, and it depicts the horrors endured by 3 young men, 2 white and 1 black, who had come to Mississippi in a fight for equality. Another one, titled The Problem We All Live With, depicts a young black girl in a white dress being escorted to school by U.S. Marshals. Incidentally, her grandson is a docent at the Norman Rockwell Museum today. Of his gripping and powerful illustrations, he said, for 47 years I portrayed the best of all possible worlds. Grandfathers and puppy dogs, things like that. That kind of stuff is dead now, and I think it's about time. Now, in the 1960s, he struck out in a new direction, and he boldly tackled political issues. His Peace Corps illustrations captured the idealism of the Kennedy years in a realistic setting. And he painted portraits of presidents, world leaders. In 1962, he was quoted in Esquire magazine saying, "I call myself an illustrator, but I'm not an illustrator. I paint storytelling pictures, which are quite popular, but unfashionable. The world is rapidly changing." Now, unfashionable was a misnomer. His works were very popular, but he was extremely sensitive about the way that the art world and the public judged him. He always realized he was an illustrator, not an artist. And if you look around the world, you'll never see a Norman Rockwell picture in an art gallery. Art critics and curators believe that he did this for his job. He was an illustrator and not an artist. He was acutely aware of his goals. He wanted to be viewed as an artist, and he had this lack of critical acceptance, and he now began to accept the idea that he would never be completely accepted into the art world. He said, no man with a conscience can just bat out illustrations. He's got to put all of his talent, all of his feelings into them. If illustration is not considered art, then that's something that we have brought upon ourselves by not considering ourselves as artists. I believe illustrators should say, I'm not just an illustrator, I'm an artist. Now, it's often been said that Norman Rockwell provided a commodity that people could rely on, and it's reflected in his over 5,000 illustrations that he completed throughout his life. After a particularly successful career, he finally realized his lifelong dream. He had a one-man art show in Manhattan at the age of 74. The Bernard Dannenberg Galleries of New York City organized a retrospective of his work in 1969. Not one art critic attended, and not one art critic praised the show. And he said, I'm glad that I don't rely solely upon the approval of the critics, because I've certainly had to be satisfied without it. But the show was a huge popular success. Almost all of the paintings that were featured, and there were over 50, sold instantly at the preview party held the evening before the opening, and it was a $15 million sale. The excitement that stirred over his show led to a countrywide touring exhibition that libraries and community centers had, no art galleries, crowds swarming to appreciate the paintings of their best beloved artist. He eventually went on to establish a trust to protect his personal collection that he knew wasn't going to wind up in a museum. In 1972 is when he did this. He placed his works in the Old Corner House Stockbridge Historical Society, which later became the Norman Rockwell Museum, February 3rd, 1994. It was the 100th anniversary of Norman Rockwell's birth. In 1976, he had his last published work on the cover of American Artist magazine. He painted himself draping a happy birthday banner on their Liberty Bell in observance of the 4th of July and the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. In 1977, President Gerald Ford presented him with the country's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And it was given to him for his vivid and affectionate portraits of our country. On November 8th, 1978, he died of lung cancer in Stockbridge at the age of 84, and he left an unfinished canvas on the easel. His now nostalgic paintings and illustrations continue to live on in American society, depicting lifetimes, decades of pleasantry and pain. A second edition of his autobiography was published in 1988 with new material from Tom Rockwell, one of his sons, covering the final 20 years of his father's life. His ability to relate to the values and the events of an evolving society made him a hero, a visionary, a friend, not only to Americans, but to people all over the globe. He said, without thinking about it too much in specific terms, I was showing the America I knew and observed to others who might not have noticed. His genuine love and understanding of what makes us all human is unrestrained by geographic boundaries. His singular vision has touched the lives of millions around the world, varied in culture, and yet we all have the same emotions, dreams, and insecurities. His prolific career spanned the days of the horse-drawn carriages to the momentous leap that landed mankind on the moon. While history is in the making all around him, he chose to fill his canvases with the small details and nuances of the everyday people. Taken together in many of his paintings, it captures something more elusive, the essence of the American spirit. He said, I paint life as I would like it to be. Mythical, idealistic, innocent, his paintings evoke a longing for a time and a place that existed only in the realm of his rich imagination and the hopes of and the aspirations of the American nation. According to the filmmaker Steven Spielberg, who is one of the biggest collectors of Norman Rockwell paintings, he painted the American dream better than anyone. He's given us a legacy of ourselves as we were, as we are, and this is Norman Rockwell's heritage. And that's the story of Norman Rockwell. Don't forget your handouts. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
What exactly is the difference between an illustrator and an artist? I don't understand.
An illustrator gets paid for his work as his salary, and an artist doesn't. They just receive commit. That's the simple distinction. And illustrators throughout time have been frustrated with the fact that they were never considered artists because they worked for a company or an advertising agency, which is unfortunate because many artists have commissions to do their work. Bouguereau, for example, never even started a painting until he got over $100,000 for it. So he was basically paid for his work, but yes.
How many paintings does he have out there?
Over 5,000. And if you go to the Norman Rockwell Museum, they're on a revolving schedule. Every 3 months they put new paintings up, so you never see the same paintings twice. They're all kept in the bowels of the building. It's remarkable. And in the basement, they have all 324 covers of the Saturday Evening Post.
What is the status of the sons today, and are any of them interested in art?
Yes, his youngest son is a sculptor, and many of his sculptures are on the grounds of the Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge. Another artist is another son is a writer, and then the oldest son is the writer who helped write the biographies. But he also became an artist, kind of a Sunday artist. And the middle son became an artist, but never very successful. You don't see any of his work like Andrew Wyeth's kids, for example, or the people in the Wyeth family. Yes.
Is there a publication that will tell you where all his art is now residing?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of them at his museum. I know they're not in any museums, although the Akron Museum, being one of the very few museums, had a retrospective of his work. I commend them for doing that, and the crowds were incredible when his work was here.
The reason I asked that, I was invited to go to Geneva Park, and they have at least.
Yes, they do, yeah.
And I don't know how many people even know they're there. They are spectacular.
They're remarkable. They absolutely are, yeah. Any other questions?
Would you tell us what you said? Where are they located, please?
Neela Park. It's on Taylor Road, East Cleveland. You can go in and tour the GE Neela Park, yeah. Noble Road, yeah. Yes?
Did his mother ever know that he was famous? Did she pass away?
You know, the sad part about all of it, no, he became famous at 17, so of course his family knew. She always resented the fact that he kind of disobeyed her and became an artist. He separated from his family and never really kept in touch with either his brother or his parents. His father was very distant and not very warm, so Norman Rockwell just kind of created his own legacy without his family, unfortunately. They did benefit from a lot of the sales, but Molly primarily is the person who benefited the most, and Stockbridge was donated all of those paintings, Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the Through the Eyes of the Artist series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.